with me, and you will suffer my wrath.
There's a certain kind of actor who gets close enough to the top that everyone assumes they're already there. They get the Oscar nomination. They get the magazine covers. They get the look, the presence, the credibility. And then the industry quietly decides they don't quite fit the mold it's building next. Tom Berenger got that close. After Platoon in 1986, he was right on the edge of something massive. So what happened? And does it even matter in the way we think it does? Let's peel it back. Thomas Michael Moore was born on May 31st, 1949, in Chicago. Berenger didn't grow up around show business. Acting wasn't the plan. It was something he stumbled into later. He went to the University of Missouri to study journalism. That's worth pausing on. Journalism, not drama, not performance studies. He was going to be a writer, or at least that was the plan. He was going to observe other people's stories, not inhabit them. But at some point during college, on what's been described as a bet with a roommate, he auditioned for a production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at the campus theater. He won the role of Nick, the second male lead, and something clicked. It wasn't a grand revelation, the kind that gets romanticized in interviews. It was more like a door swinging open and him walking through it before he had time to overthink it. There's something in that origin that tells you a lot about Berenger. He didn't arrive at acting through ambition or obsession. He arrived at it through impulse, through curiosity, through a willingness to try something without needing to know where it led. That quality of not being precious about the thing, of just doing it, would define a lot of his choices later on. He graduated in 1971 with a degree in journalism, but he wasn't going to use it, not in the way he'd planned. After college, Berenger did something that almost never gets mentioned in the tidy version of his biography. He worked as a flight attendant for Eastern Airlines, based in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Try to square that with the man who would later play Staff Sergeant Barnes, a flight attendant in the Caribbean. It's the kind of detail that reminds you how much randomness there is in any career, how many side roads a person takes before landing on the thing that defines them. He transferred to New York in 1973, studied at the HB studio under the tradition of Herbert Berghoff, did regional theater, and changed his surname professionally because there was already a Tom Moore registered with Actors Equity. He took the name Berenger from a school friend. Even his name was a kind of reinvention. His early work was steady, not spectacular. He appeared on the soap opera One Life to Live, playing a lawyer named Tim Siegel. He did small film roles. His first feature was an independent film called Rush It, shot in 1976, barely released. Then came Looking for Mr. Goodbar in 1977, where he played a supporting role opposite Diane Keaton. It wasn't a breakout, but it was a foothold. He followed it with The Dogs of War in 1980, working alongside Christopher Walken in a mercenary thriller that didn't set the world on fire, but showed Berenger could hold the screen in intense, physical material. And then came 1983, which was the year things started to shift. He appeared in two films that each opened up a different lane for him. First, The Big Chill, Lawrence Kasdan's ensemble drama about a group of college friends reuniting after a funeral. Berenger played Sam Weber, a successful television actor. Handsome, charming, a little hollow underneath the surface ease. It was a performance built on likability, the kind of role that makes audiences think, that guy could be a movie star. He had the jaw. He had the warmth. He looked like he belonged on a poster. Then, that same year, Eddie and the Cruisers. He played the former piano player and lyricist for a rock band whose frontman may, or may not have died in a car crash. The film didn't land big at the time, but it built a cult following over the years on home video. Between those two films, you could see the beginning of a pattern. Berenger wasn't being typecast yet, but he was being noticed for a specific thing, a masculine ease, a physical presence, a willingness to sit inside a role without pushing too hard. And then Platoon changed everything. Oliver Stone's 1986 film was raw, visceral, and serious in a way that Vietnam War movies hadn't quite been before. It wasn't stylized. It wasn't romantic. It felt like mud and heat and fear. And right in the middle of it was Berenger as Staff Sergeant Bob Barnes, a battle-scar platoon leader whose face was covered in prosthetic scar tissue and whose moral compass had been burned away by the war. It was a performance built on control. Barnes doesn't explain himself. He doesn't monologue about what the war has done to him. He just exists as a force, terrifying, magnetic, and completely convinced of his own authority. What made the performance remarkable wasn't just the intensity. It was the stillness underneath it. Berenger played Barnes as someone who had gone past fear, past doubt, past the normal human responses to violence. And that emptiness, that calm at the center of a horrifying character, is what made him so unsettling. The role sat opposite Willem Dafoe's Sergeant Elias, and the tension between those two characters became the moral spine of the film. Charlie Sheen's young private was the audience surrogate, but it was Barnes and Elias who gave the film its weight. And between those two poles, Berenger was the one who lingered. You couldn't look away from him, and you couldn't quite forgive what he represented. The performance earned Berenger an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and won him the Golden Globe in that category. Platoon itself won Best Picture. For a moment, it looked like the trajectory was locked in. Here was an actor with the good looks of a leading man and the intensity of a character actor. That's a rare combination, the kind Hollywood is supposed to reward with bigger and bigger roles, with the keys to the kingdom. But here's where it gets more interesting than the simple version of the story, because what Berenger did next wasn't what the industry expected, or maybe more accurately, the industry wasn't sure what to do with what he offered. After Platoon, he starred in Someone to Watch Over Me in 1987, a Ridley Scott thriller opposite Mimi Rogers. It was a solid, stylish film. Then came Betrayed in 1988, a Costa Gavras film where Berenger played a charismatic farmer who turns out to be a white supremacist leader. It was a bold, uncomfortable role, the kind of part where the actor has to make you like someone before revealing the ugliness underneath. He was good in it. Very good, actually. But neither film became a cultural event. Then Major League in 1989, as the veteran catcher Jake Taylor, with blown-out knees and one last shot at relevance, Berenger showed something different again: comic timing, vulnerability, whether likability. The film was a surprise hit, and it should have added another dimension to how the industry saw him. Here was a guy who could be terrifying in Platoon, suave in a Ridley Scott thriller, morally complex in a political drama, and genuinely funny in a baseball comedy. That range is unusual. Most actors who get nominated for an Oscar playing a scarred war criminal don't then turn around and make you root for them as a washed-up ballplayer trying to win back his ex-girlfriend. But Berenger did it, and he did it with ease. He also had a small role in Oliver Stone's Born on the 4th of July that same year. Then at Play in the Fields of the Lord in 1991, directed by Hector Babenco, where he played a half-Cheyenne mercenary in the Amazon. The choices were bold, varied, and consistently interesting. But the parts that would have cemented him at the A-list level, the parts go to Harrison Ford, or Mel Gibson, or Kevin Costner in that era, didn't come. Not because he wasn't capable, but because the slots were filled, and because the image Hollywood had of him never quite crystallized into a single marketable thing. Think about the actors who dominated that late 1980s, early 1990s window. Ford had the action-adventure hero locked down. Costner had the earnest American leading man. Gibson had the roguish intensity. Each of them had an identity the industry could sell in a sentence. Berenger had something more diffuse. He could be any of those things, but he wasn't defined as any one of them. And in a system that runs on definition, that can work against you. This is not a failure story. It's something more subtle than that. It's about how an actor who can do many things sometimes gets rewarded less than an actor who does one thing extremely well. The industry wants clarity. It wants to know what it's selling. And Berenger, with his ability to shift between warmth and menace, between humor and gravity, was harder to package than someone who stayed in a single lane. By the early 1990s, the landscape was shifting in ways that affected actors like Berenger across the board. The adult drama, the mid-budget, character-driven film aimed at grown-ups, was beginning its long decline. Studios were moving toward franchise thinking. The blockbuster was eating up more of the oxygen. Jurassic Park came out in 1993. The same year Berenger was doing Gettysburg. One of those films changed what movies could earn. The other was the kind of film that was quietly being pushed to the margins, and the actors who thrived in the new environment were either younger, or they'd already locked in their positions at the top before the shift. There wasn't as much room in the middle, and the middle is where a lot of serious, talented actors found themselves squeezed. The mid-1990s were unkind to a whole generation of performers who had built their reputations on the kind of film that the studios were losing interest in making. It wasn't personal. It was structural. But the result was the same. Less opportunity, smaller budgets, and a slow drift away from the center of the conversation. Berenger also did Sliver in 1993, a thriller that was part of the post-Basic Instinct erotic thriller wave, and Chasers in 1994, a comedy directed by Dennis Hopper. These weren't prestige projects, but they were work, and they kept him in front of cameras during a period when a lot of actors with similar profiles were struggling to stay relevant. Berenger's work in this period is more interesting than it often gets credit for. Gettysburg in 1993, where he played Confederate General James Longstreet, is the film he said he watched more than any of his others. It's a long, deliberate, deeply committed Civil War epic, and his performance in it carries a weight of reluctance and sorrow that feels lived in. Longstreet knows the war is being lost. He knows the strategy is wrong, and he carries out his duty anyway, with a heaviness that Berenger communicates not through grand speeches, but through the way he holds his body, the way his eyes track across a battlefield he knows will be a slaughter. It's one of his finest pieces of work, and it's the kind of performance that finds its audience over decades, not opening weekends. That same year, Sniper, where he played Marine Marksman Thomas Beckett. It was a genre film, taut and efficient, and Berenger brought to it the same commitment he brought to everything else. The role would generate multiple sequels over the years. He appeared in several of them, and it gave him an anchor in the action genre that kept him working steadily. Some people might look at those sequels and see a step down from Oscar-nominated prestige. But another way to see it is this. Berenger found a character he could return to, that audiences wanted to see him play, and he stayed with it. There's a pragmatism in that choice, and also a professionalism. That doesn't get enough respect. The Substitute came in 1996, a genre film about a mercenary who goes undercover as a high school teacher. It performed well enough to generate its own franchise. He also established the Tom Berenger Acting Scholarship Fund back in 1988, quietly investing in the next generation of performers. These are not the actions of someone who checked out. These are the actions of someone who cared about the work and the craft even when the spotlight had moved elsewhere. If you weren't paying close attention, it might have looked like a career winding down, but that framing misses something important. Berenger wasn't inactive. He wasn't struggling to find work. He was working constantly. He co-produced the 1997 TNT miniseries Rough Riders, in which he also starred as Theodore Roosevelt. He was producing, choosing projects, staying engaged with the craft on his own terms. There's a version of this story where that shift gets narrated as decline, and I want to push back on that, because what it actually looks like, when you lay it all out, is an actor who kept making choices. Some of those choices led to smaller films. Some led to direct-to-video projects. But the work itself didn't stop, and the commitment to it didn't waver. There's a difference between an actor who can't get work and an actor who's working in a different register than the one the mainstream is paying attention to. Berenger has never been someone who courts the press or manufactures public drama. He's not on social media performing his personality. He's not doing the talk show circuit with rehearsed anecdotes. For most of his career, he's lived away from the Hollywood epicenter, spending time in places like Beaufort, South Carolina. That kind of remove can be a choice, and it can also be misread. In an industry that rewards visibility, staying quiet can look like disappearing. But it can also just be a person living their life and doing their job without making the job their entire identity. I want to be careful here, because there's a temptation in these kinds of retrospectives to create a narrative about an actor's private life that fits the story we want to tell. The recluse, the wounded star, the man who turned his back on it all. That's not what this is. Berenger chose a certain kind of life. He chose where to live, how much to engage with the publicity machine, how much of himself to share. Those are personal decisions, not dramatic plot points. And treating them as evidence of some deeper crisis does a disservice to someone who seems to have simply preferred a quieter existence than the one Hollywood typically demands. He appeared on the final season of Cheers, playing Rebecca Howe's blue-collar love interest, and earned an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Guest Actor in a Comedy Series. It's a small credit that says a lot. He could walk into a sitcom, hold his own, get nominated, and walk back out without it becoming a defining moment. That kind of versatility is easy to overlook precisely because it doesn't demand attention. And then, years later, two moments that reminded people he was still there. In 2010, Inception. Christopher Nolan cast him as Peter Browning, a business executive, in a film that became one of the biggest of the year. It was a small role, but it put Berenger's face back on enormous screens after a long stretch away from major studio productions. It had been nearly a decade since his last high-profile film appearance, in Training Day in 2001, where he'd played a corrupt cop alongside Denzel Washington and Ethan Hawke. Inception was a reminder, not a comeback. There's a distinction there. A comeback implies you went somewhere. Berenger hadn't gone anywhere. He'd just been working in rooms the mainstream wasn't looking at. Then, in 2012, Hatfields and McCoys, the television miniseries on the History Channel, starring Kevin Costner. Berenger played Jim Vance, the volatile uncle of the Hatfield patriarch. It was a role that required the kind of dangerous, unpredictable energy that had always been part of his range, and he leaned into it fully. And he won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a miniseries or a movie. Not nominated. Won. More than 25 years after his Oscar nomination for Platoon, Berenger was still capable of delivering work that the industry recognized at the highest level. That fact tends to get underplayed in the standard narrative because it doesn't fit the tidy arc of rise and decline. If someone's career is supposed to be a story of fading away, winning an Emmy in your 60s doesn't compute. It's messier than that, more real than that, and it speaks to something essential about Berenger as a performer. The talent never went anywhere, even when the opportunities changed. What Berenger's career reveals, if you look at it honestly, is something that applies to a lot of actors who came up in the 1980s. The path from promising to established to legendary is not a straight line, and the industry doesn't always keep the door open for people who don't play the visibility game. Some actors maintain their position through relentless self-promotion, through strategic choices, through sheer luck of landing the right franchise at the right time. Others do the work, make their choices, and let the chips fall. Berenger seems to have been the second kind, for better and for worse. It's also worth saying that the conversation around actors like Berenger has changed in the age of streaming and rediscovery. Films like Gettysburg and Eddie and the Cruisers, which didn't necessarily dominate the box office in their time, have found devoted audiences over the years. The internet has a way of preserving work that the theatrical window forgot. And so the version of Berenger's career that exists in the cultural memory is actually broader than the version that existed in real time, because people are still finding these films, still watching them, still being affected by them. That's a different kind of legacy than the one that comes from opening weekends and magazine covers, but it might be a more durable one. His influence is quiet but traceable. That combination of physical menace and emotional vulnerability that he brought to Barnes and Platoon, you can see echoes of it in the way later actors approached military and authority roles. The refusal to make the villain purely evil, the insistence on grounding the monster in something recognizably human, that's a choice Berenger made in 1986 that rippled outward. When you watch certain performances in later war films and see an antagonist who's frightening precisely because he believes he's right, that owes something to what Berenger did. Barnes wasn't a caricature. He was a man who had looked at the worst of what war could do and decided it made him stronger. That's a specific kind of villainy, and Berenger defined it. He also set a template for a specific kind of career longevity. The actor who stays in the game by being willing to work in genre films, in television, in lower-budget projects, without treating those as beneath him. There's a whole generation of 1980s leading men who either couldn't or wouldn't make that adjustment. They held out for the parts that stopped coming. or they retired when the offers changed. Berenger didn't either. He kept showing up. He took the roles that were available and brought the same attention to them that he brought to Platoon or Gettysburg. And the fact that he's still working in his mid-70s, with credits as recent as 2024, speaks to something durable in his approach. Not everyone who gets an Oscar nomination in their 30s is still getting cast in their 70s. Most aren't. That persistence is its own kind of achievement, and it says something about the difference between a career built on heat and career built on work. As of the last few years, Berenger has continued to appear in films. Plan B in 2024. One More Shot in 2024. He's been cast in new projects. He's not retired. He's not doing farewell tours. He's doing what he's done for almost 50 years, showing up, doing the work, and moving on to the next thing. Whether anyone notices is almost beside the point for someone who seems to have made peace with the difference between fame and career. So here's the question I started with. What happened to Tom Berenger? And the more honest answer is, nothing happened to him. He kept working. He kept choosing. He won an Emmy more than 2 decades after his Oscar nomination. He showed up in one of the biggest films of the 2010s. He didn't vanish. He just stopped being the thing the industry wanted to talk about. And he seems to have been more or less fine with that. There's something freeing in that, if you think about it. The pressure to stay at the very top, to remain the name on everybody's lips, to maintain the kind of visibility that Hollywood demands. That pressure breaks people. It distorts careers and personalities alike. Berenger seems to have sidestepped that particular trap, not with a dramatic announcement or a philosophical statement, but simply by continuing to do the work he wanted to do, in the places where the work was available. That might not be the dramatic answer. It might not satisfy the part of us that wants every career to be a clean story of triumph or tragedy, of rise and fall, of glory and ruin, but it's closer to the truth. And the truth, when it comes to how careers actually unfold in Hollywood, is almost always more complicated and more interesting than the myth. Tom Berenger is still here. He's still working. And if you go back and watch what he's done, really watch it, from the Big Chill through Platoon through Gettysburg, through that Emmy-winning turn in Hatfields and McCoys, what you'll find is not a cautionary tale or a mystery. What you'll find is a body of work. Steady, varied, committed, and real. If this gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We'll see you in the next one.